Hello ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back into the studio. This week's video is going to be an excerpt from one of my Patreon videos. If you want to support the channel and watch the full video, which is over an hour long, head over to patreon.com/Eirik Arnesen. You'll find a link in the description below. Enjoy. First step we must do before beginning the application of hydroresin is to release areas of our sculpture that won't release well on their own. Silicone doesn't need a release agent as it hardly sticks to anything but itself. So no Vaseline or clay slip or any form of release agent is used on the silicone itself. The metal support poles exiting out of our sculpture does need to be released, however. They will get a generous coating of Vaseline to make sure their hydroresin mother mold doesn't stick to them. I also apply Vaseline to the wooden board because I'd like to be able to reuse it and the resin will stick to it. Working so clean that no resin falls from the sculpture down onto the wooden base is certainly beyond me. So I cover it with Vaseline so any stray hydroresin can easily be removed using a paint scraper once the mold is finished. The first layer of hydroresin can then be applied. This application is very straightforward. The consistency of the hydroresin is probably around whipped cream or perhaps a slightly thin peanut butter consistency. It brushes on really easily and doesn't really go anywhere when applied. It doesn't run down the figure, in other words. This means I can apply it and leave it. One of the worst things to have to deal with in mold making is chasing material that isn't setting up and is running everywhere and doesn't stay where you want it to stay. I'd rather have to brush a little bit more aggressively and carefully compared to chasing material that is too thin and running everywhere. The brush that I'm using is a super simple, cheap synthetic brush for house painting that I bought at a local supermarket. Any synthetic brush will do just fine. Even a hog bristle brush will probably do just fine, but I prefer these slightly finer synthetic brushes for this purpose. You should pick a size brush that lets you work cleanly and cover as much area as possible at once. Anything larger than this will create more of a mess for you to clean up later. Anything smaller than this, and you will have to work for much longer and much harder. The size of the brush is obviously dependent on the size of the piece that you are casting, so there's no formula that I can really give you for this. Speaking of working clean, notice here how I try my best to clean up the edges as I go and not wait for the material to set up. The reason for this is that while the material is soft, it comes off without disturbing anything else that I've added. If the material is set, it can crack and chip into the area where I want to be covering the silicone. So cleaning up now allows for easier and more controlled cleanup. The edges that I clean are these ones. These edges, or the top of the silicone walls, are going to be where I will cut the pieces apart. I will slice these walls in half with a knife. They will be exposed to the open air. There are mold making techniques where you cover up this edge, but I tend to leave them open to the air because then I can see how my mold is aligned during casting, if the two halves are fitting together properly. The two mother mold pieces making up one part of the mold are not going to touch each other. The silicone touches, and the mother mold cradles the silicone, like you can see here in this cross section. The reason we don't just go straight into the fiberglass and I do this splash coat to begin with is because I like to capture the detail of my silicone on the inside of the mother mold so that the two registers really well to each other. You certainly could go straight into fiberglass without any first layer covering the surface, and the mold would most likely be just fine. The first layer is just an extra precaution that I take because I'm, well, a little bit extra careful. I've worked hard figuring out this mold so far, not to mention sculpting the sculpture, so I'm not going to take any chances or any shortcuts at this stage. I'm attempting to work in batches here, which is what I prefer to do. What this means is essentially doing all the first layers at once then moving on to do the next step everywhere before moving to the next step after that, etc., etc. And there are a few reasons for this. When working alone with a time-sensitive material, I like to do what I can do to minimize stress. The best way I've found to do this is to work very controlled and slow, limiting what you have to think about to only a very few things. If I'm only working on the first layer, the only thing I'm thinking about is doing a good job on that first layer. Keeping track of how far along you are when you are at different steps everywhere, that's going to become another contributing factor to stress. So by being at the same step everywhere, we minimize this level of stress somewhat. So remember from the first episode in this series, we decided to split the mold making of this piece up into 3 separate stages. Now we did cover the whole piece in silicone, which we had to do so it doesn't dry out, but we've only built the silicone walls that pertain to the step that we are currently at, which is making monomolds for the female figure, the arms of Kronos, and the arm of the female figure. If you remember, this mold is so complicated that I decided to remove these pieces in green before proceeding to the pieces in yellow, removing those, and then finally making the last monomold pieces for the body and base in red. So I'm going to make the monomold for all of these and remove them one by one. By doing this, I'll have a much easier time making the monomolds for the next step as there is nothing there to block them. Obviously, we have a lot of parts of the sculpture overlapping each other here, which creates a lot of issues. As you can see, I plan to include a little bit of the base below the female's feet in this first section. I learned by casting the smaller version of this maquette that it's better not to have too many connections that matter a lot. A connection between an arm and a shoulder, for example, matters a lot. There's anatomy there. A connection between an ankle and a foot matters a lot. There's anatomy there. If they are misaligned, which can easily happen, the anatomy doesn't work and it becomes very difficult to resculpt. So in as many places as I can, I've moved these connections down to the base, because if the connection between the base and the other base doesn't align perfectly, I can easily retouch them without much consequence. The base is sculpted very loose and is not going to be very hard to replicate or resculpt in hydro resin, while something as particular as the anatomy of an ankle is going to be very hard to replicate and resculpt in hydro resin. Now you will see this in a much later episode in this series.